Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. So, we're over a year into a new government, and nobody could possibly argue that there hasn't been a significant recalibration in the way Canada thinks about climate policy and environmental regulation. If you haven't read Aaron Wherry's very balanced piece on this on cbc.ca, you should. It was published a couple of days before Prime Minister Carney and Premier Smith got behind a podium and announced the terms of Canada-Alberta MOU agreement. That only further cemented the balance between the environment, pipelines, and project building has shifted from what it was, say, back in 2018. So has the public's perception, by the way. All of the polling out there indicates that Canadians now are prioritizing economic growth over environmental protection, especially climate action. This is the issue I want to explore today from multiple angles in 3 different individual conversations. First up is the author of that article I mentioned, Aaron Wherry, to set the table, dive a little deeper into the issues, and Aaron very thoughtfully explains the politics behind all this to us and why things are proceeding in Ottawa as they are. Then we bring on Rick Smith, president of the Canadian Climate Institute, for his perspective. We talk about emissions reduction, what's happening to the industrial carbon price, the clean energy economy, and more. And it's no secret that Rick is terribly disappointed with the industrial carbon price, with both the level and the time at which it takes to phase in. He thinks that that could be more aggressive and help Canada meet its emissions policy, which it now will not meet. Finally, I want to explore the energy sector, particularly oil, the economic impact versus opportunity cost of pipelines, and the tension between market forces and climate policy. For that, we have Andrew Leach, energy and environmental economist and professor at the University of Alberta, who makes it clear he thinks oil is going to be a viable commodity for a very long time, and that this a new oil pipeline is a wise investment for the Canadian economy. As an added bonus, I'll also ask him about his participation in the new federalist Canadian policy initiative, Lead Not Leave, out in Alberta, fighting separatism and fighting for Canada. Listen for that. Aaron, great to see you. Where do we find you today?
I am at home in Ottawa.
Well, it's chilly in Ottawa today, and it's far too late in May for it to be chilly.
But it's Ottawa, so...
It's Ottawa, and so it's chilly, and the transit system doesn't work.
Yeah,
so that's
yeah,
all
exactly. Good. We have the best of both worlds.
Thanks for coming on. I really want to talk to you because you've written several very interesting pieces for the CBC website about the climate implications of what's been going on with respect to the federal government in Alberta. Part of it in the MOU, some of it outside of the MOU. And so I think you're a great person to help us sort of set the table for a conversation about this. Could we maybe just start with the barest of facts? What are the critical elements of this MOU and anything outside the MOU that's relevant to it? So what are the pieces here?
Right. So, I mean, obviously the biggest piece, or the piece that's going to get talked about the most, or has been talked about the most, and will continue to be talked about the most until maybe it's completed, as a pipeline. The promise of one, the possibility of one running from Alberta to British Columbia, although we don't really know what the route will be at this point, or who will build it, or whether it'll happen. It certainly seems that the federal government is very open to the possibility, at the very least. So there's the pipeline. There is the industrial carbon price, which is the piece that was negotiated, or they sort of came to an agreement about last week. That, I think, is the sort of key climate piece at this point. There's a sort of secondary piece to that, I think, with the clean electricity regulations, and we'll see where that lands. But as of right now, it's the sort of two pieces of the MOU that matter, I think, most, are the pipeline and the industrial carbon price, and then sort of not secondary necessarily, but part of tangential to that conversation is this discussion paper that the federal government released a week earlier, which aims to open a discussion, at least, about changing environmental regulations to make it easier and faster to get projects built. So those are sort of, I think, the main pieces that are we're waiting to see how they all kind of come together, I guess.
Right. Okay. So let's just take them individually. So a pipeline, my understanding is that the TMX pipeline, which the federal government built or backstop paid for, built, has actually had a materially positive impact on the Canadian economy, measurably positive impact on the Canadian economy. May have cost the government too much money to build. That's a different matter. But has had a materially positive impact. Is there any reason to believe that another pipeline will not have another materially? Just to be clear, why is that? My understanding is that is because we're no longer captive to the United States market, so therefore we get something closer to the world price for oil as opposed to a discounted price that Americans were paying. That seems like a twofer. So does a new pipeline just double that? Is that all upside?
I mean, I hesitate. I would defer to people like my friend Andrew Leach in Alberta to completely answer questions on economics of pipelines. I think, the government's argument, the federal government's argument is sort of twofold, right? One is economic strength, and then I think the second part is economic resilience. So you build the pipeline, it strengthens the Canadian economy, and it also diversifies Canadian trade partners. And this is at a time, of course, when those are two things that are big priorities for not only the Carney government, but arguably for the country. And so I think that's sort of the economic argument. I mean, look, you'll hear lots of, counter arguments and dissent on that point of how wise it is to build a pipeline right now, just as there are always arguments about it. I think politically, it's interesting to raise the example of TMX because, the Trudeau government bought that pipeline, built it, and its reward for that was unclear, right? It maybe you can make the argument that it was a political win insofar as it dampened concerns about the unity of the country, and it maybe had a positive impact in that regard in sort of addressing some of the concerns in Alberta, but it obviously didn't head off what could be a referendum this year on whether Alberta should stay part of the country. So it's politically and economically. Like, I think economically, there's probably a very strong argument for it. Politically, it's always hard, and the benefits are, sometimes hard to see, I think.
I was actually wondering whether the political benefits were clearer than the economic benefits, because in the sense that, to my eye, and I don't really know how it happened, but I feel like it did happen, that our capacity to build a pipeline from Alberta became a bit of a litmus test about whether the country works, period, and particularly whether it works for Alberta.
Yeah, it's on the one hand, you want to say it's a lot of political weight to put on a single project, right? That a pipeline should be the litmus test for whether this country that has been around for, a fairly long time now, whether that country works is down to a single pipeline. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that, the Trudeau government getting the pipeline built, getting TMX built, beat the alternative, right? Because if that pipeline hadn't been built, the talk about whether the Trudeau government could get things done, whether the country worked, Alberta's place in the country would have been that much harder to make. It's always hard to do counterfactuals, but you can definitely look at it and say it beat the alternative. And the other part of it, and this is going a bit tangential off your question, but when TMX got built, when they bought TMX, when they approved TMX, there were all sorts of concerns and discussion about, the Liberals are going to get destroyed in British Columbia. People like John Wilkinson, people like Terry Beach, they're losing their seats. They're done. And they did lose, if I remember correctly, they did lose a few seats in British Columbia, but it was not nearly the wipeout that people expected.
Right.
And and people like John Wilkinson and Terry Beach kept their seats. And I think I think you have to give some credit to the federal government for the Trudeau government for accomplishing that, because I think, the Trudeau government had sort of built this idea that you needed social license, right, to get pipelines built. That's what we talked about a lot during the Trudeau era, was social license. And as much as there were still people in British Columbia who opposed TMX, the effort the Trudeau Liberals put into environmental protection, climate policy, I think really dampened some of the opposition and even maybe boosted support for TMX. And so I think, I'm sure you've realized this probably long before I did, but in politics, it's the same story sort of repeating itself every 5 to 10 years. And it feels like Carney's now back in this situation where it's like, okay, we're going to have a discussion about environmental regulations and whether there's too much or too little. And we're going to have a discussion about how to build a pipeline and how to win support for a pipeline. And I think that's, as much as the MOU has been signed and they've got an agreement with Alberta, I think now the big question is like, can Carney sort of hold what seems to be openness in the Canadian public, what seems to be support or for the idea of a pipeline, whether he can hold that and get a pipeline built.
So thank you for raising that issue about the Trudeau era bargain, because for a while it seemed to me that was the discussion, that the way to, like, people I don't think will remember this, but when Trudeau was running for office in 2015, he was not talking about shutting down the oil sands. He was not talking about restricting oil and gas production. He, in fact, explicitly said that no country in the world would find this under the ground of their territory and not exploit it. So, in fact, his argument was that by being good at the environment, being good about the way we did it, that we would have license to do it in Canada. We could get pipelines built that Harper couldn't get built. And second of all, that the world would buy our oil right to the end because it was the cleanest oil, right? That looks like it's not true. Because I don't know that people are buying oil on the basis of emissions around the world, and I don't know that they ever will. But that was the bargain. So what has changed that has Trudeau-era environmental people like Guilbeault and, Wilkinson's quiet, but that's because he's going overseas, Catherine McKenna, up in arms about this? If oil production grew under Trudeau and he explicitly intended it to grow, what is the problem now?
How much time have you got? So first, I think that's interesting. You mentioned the idea that the carbon, the low carbon oil or the environmental structure around oil and whether people are buying oil based on that. I think that's a really interesting idea because I think Carney is still sort of talking about that, the idea that low carbon.
That's got to be the reason for carbon capture, right?
Yeah, for a while they were trying to talk about decarbonized oil until people pointed out that term didn't really make a lot of sense. But I think he's still trying to sell that idea to a certain extent. But to answer your larger question, I think, you're right. You go back to the start of the Trudeau era, and it was coming off of some big Harper era changes to environmental regulations, and that had in part spurred the Idle No More protests. It was coming off of the Harper government's sort of struggle to put together a real climate plan for the country. And Trudeau's argument was, as you say, if we had real climate policy, if we had credible environmental regulations, we would get pipelines built. He goes so far as to say, if we had credible climate policy, Obama would have approved Keystone. And so the Trudeau government comes in and does a bunch of things, obviously, in terms of climate policy, but it also brings in new environmental regulations. And the environmental regulations are pitched as both a far more comprehensive, responsible approach to approving projects, but also getting back to that idea of social license, they're going to set the terms, and that's going to make it easier to get projects built because people are you're going to deal with people's objections through this process. And if people believe it's a credible process, then people are less likely to oppose projects. And the Trudeau government obviously does a lot on climate policy and doesn't, I think according to the last projections near the end of the Trudeau era, doesn't quite get Canada on track for the more ambitious climate target that Trudeau then set, but gets us kind of moving in that direction. And now obviously you have Carney coming in and to a certain extent responding, I think, to the backlash to the Trudeau policies on two fronts. So first, on the environmental regulation front, Harper's reforms caused the Idle No More movement. Trudeau's reforms lead to Jason Kenney saying, oh, this is the No More Pipelines Act. You can't get anything built anymore under these conditions. And Carney comes in and has obviously his agenda is focused on building things, right? And there's obviously a concern about environmental regulation, and there's political pushback against climate policies. And so he starts moving things aside. The carbon tax obviously dies very quickly. And he moves C5, which is the major projects office legislation, very quickly. He's trying to get things going and get things going fast. And I think if you're Stephen Guilbeault or John Wilkinson or Catherine McKenna, you're looking at what Carney's done in a year and a half or so now in office, and you just see things sort of getting pitched overboard. Not only the carbon tax, but we can get into it a bit, but the industrial carbon price gets pulled back a bit to appease Alberta. It's not clear whether the clean electricity regulations are going to survive. And now he's talking about doing something on regulations to speed things up. And it's especially, so I think, if you're Stephen Guilbeault, just go back to what he said when he quit cabinet, right? Like all these policies that he supported now seem to be going in the other direction. And so it's hard. It's I think very hard for people in that world to see, after a decade of policy kind of always moving more aggressive on climate policy, now you're seeing climate policy move in the other direction.
But boy, Aaron, it just feels like the global context is so different. So different. I mean, it's a weird thing to talk about because obviously the science isn't any different. Obviously, what's happening with climate change isn't any different, but the political context is so different. And it kind of felt like Canada was becoming isolated as a country that was still committed in such detail to all this, because even Europe seemed to be backing off. And of course, when Trump came in, America left. So, sitting here from a policy perspective, is it still reasonable to be the only country in the world that's pursuing this?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I was listening to a certain podcast the other day, and I heard that climate change voters were extinct. And I think, I think Mark Carney is responding to where the public mood broadly is, right? Just as Justin Trudeau was in 2015. I think Mark Carney is reading the tea leaves and moving where the public wants to be on this. And I think, this is speculative, but I think to a certain degree he benefits from a decade of climate action, right? It would be a lot harder to move backwards on climate policy or sort of pick away at the edges of it if there hadn't been some credibility built up over the last 10 years.
Right.
But I do wonder, I think, at what point does it sort of boomerang back on you? Jordan said on the same discussion that you guys were having the other day, like, we're going to have wildfires in a few months.
Yeah.
So what does that do to the Canadian public mood? How does the Canadian public feel if whales are in trouble and threatened by something we're doing. And I don't know that, I think the other thing that environmentalists would say is, yes, the world is more concerned right now with Trump and Iran and Ukraine and all these other issues, but you're still seeing a big push towards clean energy. You're still seeing a big push towards electrification, and it's not like other countries have completely abandoned climate policy. And even, the other thing is, you have to, Mark Carney will still say climate change is an economic imperative, but it's also like an existential crisis. Like, it's still a threat. So it's not, I don't know that Carney has unlimited room to maneuver here to completely go backwards on climate policy, but I do think he probably has room to recalibrate from where Trudeau was.
Which kind of seems to be maybe what this MOU does, to bring it back to the MOU, which is we're going to build a pipeline, but we're going to have a carbon price, and we're going to have carbon capture and storage. What is that, by the way, Aaron? Carbon capture and storage?
Essentially, and again, I'm not a scientist, is capturing the carbon and then storing it underground, essentially assuming it doesn't, preventing it from going out into the atmosphere. It's been talked about as a potential solution. The Harper government invested lots of money in this technology, and people have talked about it for a long time.
Brad Wall was a big early fan of it in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Riffing on some recent words from the Prime Minister, it's time to build in this country with concrete, steel, and code. Our presenting sponsor replies to that with a hearty huzzah and hard hats and trowels. TELUS likes to say they're always building Canada, sort of a mantra for them. In partnership with the government, they've just announced plans for 3 new sovereign AI factories in BC. They're taking an existing massive data center in Kamloops and upscaling it into an AI factory and building 2 new additional factories in Vancouver. Huzzah indeed. Not insignificantly, these are all clean AI builds. The factory cluster will run 98% on renewable energy provided by BC Hydro. They feature a closed-loop cooling system that reduces environmental impact because waste heat will be used to offset power demand in Vancouver, the equivalent of 150,000 homes. It's a potential $9 billion in economic activity, 1,000 jobs created during construction and development, and 525 permanent high-skilled jobs when up and running. All of those are impressive numbers. But when we widen the aperture, this is the kind of ambitious infrastructure that sends an important signal. At the joint announcement last week, Minister Solomon summed it up this way. By advancing this project with TELUS, we are taking concrete action to build sovereign AI capacity here in Canada. Our own firms, building things that will function under Canadian law, free from foreign ownership and coercion, used by our own researchers, innovators, businesses, and institutions. In other words, building Canada for Canada. More next week. But it was unclear whether that was true environmental policy or whether it was a dodge to avoid doing something actual to reduce emissions.
Yeah, I think this has always been the debate is, are people really committed to this, or is this just a way to kind of delay action? And I think that's, people sort of have treated the pipeline and the implementation agreement and the MOU as sort of the end of the story. But I think the real challenge is sort of still to come in terms of, you're right. The Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has said a pipeline doesn't get built unless Pathways gets built, this big, massive project for carbon capture and storage. And Pathways has been talked about for years. So is it finally actually going to go ahead? And if the pipeline starts going ahead, can the Prime Minister guarantee that Pathways is going to continue and be set up, and under what terms exactly, and at what kind of cost to the public? But it is, at this point, it is right that to say that Carney has said, you can't just build this pipeline. You need to build this pipeline, and there has to be an industrial carbon price, and there has to be Pathways. So as much as it's maybe not to the satisfaction of many people in the environmental world, it is a version, I guess, of what Trudeau did, which is to say you can have a pipeline, but it has to be developed responsibly, and it has to be it has to have a carbon price. Because, the other thing is that when people started talking about Mark Carney having a grand bargain, I mean, that's essentially what Trudeau did. He just never called it that, right? It was going to be a carbon price. It was going to be a carbon price in Alberta, carbon price nationwide, and a pipeline. And it just didn't hold. And so I think the question is, does this hold now?
Right. I don't know whether the fact that it was done with the Notley government had an impact on its durability or not in Alberta, but the carbon price is the Carney government would argue, just to give them their due, put them into this conversation. If somebody from the Carney government was here, they would say that the carbon price they inherited was completely ineffective and it had no floor, and because for various reasons it was operating at such a low price that it was not a disincentive in any way, shape, or form. And so they've actually established a credible carbon price with a floor, etc. So it may not be what people hoped the Trudeau thing would be, but it's better than what the Trudeau thing actually was, would be, I think, their argument.
Yeah, I think their argument would be basically exactly that. That on paper, the Trudeau policy was stronger, was going to go to a higher price, but that in practice, their policy is stronger because it's been arrived at through consensus and it has political buy-in now. The Liberal policy under Trudeau did exist. It was going to go to a higher price, but Alberta had frozen theirs. Had frozen their carbon price, and Saskatchewan was refusing to collect it entirely. And obviously it was opposed, across the country in various places and opposed by the federal Conservatives. And so the Carney government has lowered the price, but now they have political agreement from Alberta. Maybe, political agreement follows from Saskatchewan. I think the question then still becomes, does that lead to real policy durability? Like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is that policy still here, or do we end up back in this place where we're debating whether that policy should exist? The other piece of it, to get into some of the policy weeds, is they want to essentially backstop the price with what's called contracts for difference, which would sort of share the liability for the possibility of the price changing in the future. So they've maybe built something more durable. The problem politically and scientifically is it's not quite clear what their path to net zero is now. Because in lowering the price, people from the Climate Institute will back this up with modeling and such, that by lowering the price, they're going to result in higher emissions. And so how do you get this country on a path to net zero that looks credible, that looks realistic? And I think that's, to a certain extent, that's the next thing I think the Carney government needs to do. When they announced this policy the other day, when they announced the implementation agreement for the MOU, they didn't have any modeling of their own to show. Although, I'll throw one more thing on the table, at least from a political standpoint, from what I see, is to a certain extent, the Carney government's life is made easier by the fact that the official opposition in Ottawa, the Conservatives, don't really want to engage on climate policy. And so they aren't going to criticize the Trudeau or the Carney government if they don't have climate policy. And the NDP is, a handful of MPs in the corner. And so they may have concerns, but they aren't going to be heard.
So the only political formulation that allowed the Liberals to cut spending in the 1990s allows them to move backwards on environmental regs in this era.
Yeah, almost exactly, really. It's, if you watch Question Period, and I wouldn't recommend it, the only questions getting asked about climate policy these days are coming from the Bloc Québécois.
Right.
And that makes life easier for the Liberals. And I don't know I think, I'm sure the Conservatives think they are happy. I think the Conservatives probably think it makes sense for them not to engage on climate policy. But I think the second order effect of that is that it makes life easier for Carney.
You mentioned politics earlier. Just to take a side detour there, is there any evidence that the Liberal caucus, most of whom sat under Justin Trudeau, is at all restive about this?
It's hard to tell. There is this climate caucus.
It's one thing to eliminate the consumer carbon tax, which they would have all presumably cheered because it helped them get reelected. Another thing to get rid of the tanker ban. They probably have a stronger emotional attachment to that.
Yeah. And that's the tanker ban, I think, is really interesting because I think the future of that may depend on where the pipeline goes. But it's hard to tell where the Liberal caucus is exactly in this. We know that there's a climate caucus, this subgroup within the Liberal caucus of MPs who are concerned about climate policy. But I don't think we've really seen much publicly to see it sort of flexing its muscle. You don't hear from the co-chairs of that caucus, with the exception of Stephen Guilbeault. You don't really hear much from Liberal MPs raising concerns about climate policy. Tyler Meredith, the former policy director in the Trudeau government, you've had him on several times. He wrote a thing earlier this week that suggested that Liberal MPs had kind of been responsible for moving one of the pieces on the MOU to there's a piece in the MOU that suggests that Alberta is going to be more open to renewable energy, and he credited Liberal MPs with sort of pushing for that. I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, we haven't yet seen it flex itself publicly. I mean, lots of people, myself included, have written that in a world where the majority is so thin that Liberal, it won't take more than a handful of Liberal MPs to conceivably hold the balance of power and have some influence. But I don't think we've really seen yet any evidence that they're willing to do that. And I think that's kind of one of those pieces that people, myself included, are kind of waiting to see. Like, okay, Carney's moved. Are you guys ready to kind of plant a flag or make a move here?
Yeah, I don't know how that would play out because, of course, if you undercut the government, you risk the prospect of a different government with no climate policy at all. But one of the things I'm struggling with, I talked earlier about how the whole global context has changed, and you mentioned our targets of net zero by 2050. What are people working toward around the globe on emissions reduction now? I mean, the Paris Accord seems dead to me as near as I can tell. And we're not going to meet a lot of the interim targets that have been set as a world. I don't mean Canada, I mean as a world. We're not going to meet them. I don't know that they've been replaced. Like, what's guiding anybody else's climate policy right now? Any other country in the world, like, what are they trying to do?
It feels to me, so I don't want to say that I necessarily know what the conversation in Europe looks like. I mean, in the U.S., the one thing we haven't talked about a lot in this conversation is that the U.S. retreating from climate almost entirely has really also changed at least the context, right? Like, we're not that far removed from everyone saying the Trudeau government needs to match Joe Biden's policies in the Inflation Reduction Act, right?
Yeah.
Like, America's moving fast, and we gotta all the tax credits that exist in Canada for clean electricity and carbon capture and those things and clean tech, like all of that followed what Biden did.
Yeah.
So I think within the Canadian context, the conversation has moved almost entirely to the idea of net zero, which I'm not a historian of climate policy, but I suspect that matches what has happened a lot of times in the climate conversation, where interim targets are set for 2005 or 2020 or 2030, And then we get close to them and people go, okay, so we're not going to make this one. How about the next one?
So when Paul Martin became finance minister, one of the things he did was introduce something called 2-year rolling targets. So the department used to project deficits out 5 years, never met the target. 2 years, you got to meet it if you're not close. Because you talk about when you don't meet any of your interim targets, you're not going to meet your ultimate target, right? So where are we at?
Yeah, and I think that's, so the one thing that Trudeau government did that hasn't been completely abandoned is something called the Net Zero Accountability Act, which is supposed to bind the government to release regular updates on where it's at, set interim targets, show its progress, show its math. And I think that will eventually should still eventually force the Carney government to show its math and show where it's at. I think, the Trudeau government kind of may have bit off more than it can chew on this, because it came in with one target for 2030, and then it set an even more ambitious target. And the problem it ran into is its climate policy could meet the old target, but it couldn't meet the new target. And so it was still possible to say, well, we're not meeting our target. And so I think, if you could go back in time, they might have been better off sticking with the original target, because then they could at least say, look, we're meeting this target, so we should continue meeting future targets. But it does feel like the idea of 2030 and meeting that target has kind of slipped away at this point and isn't really a concern. And now it's all about net zero. And I'm sure environmentalists would point out that the problem with thinking about net zero in 2050 is it just allows people to think, well, that's 24 years away. We'll get there. We'll figure this out somehow. And, I think past history would show that if you don't act now, it's not going to get any easier.
Right. Yeah, 24-year targets, even worse than a 5-year target, I would suggest, in terms of mobilizing action. Just talk small p politics about this for a second, about how this can work. I mean, it feels to me like it is extraordinarily difficult in any one jurisdiction to make an argument for stringent climate policy when it doesn't appear that the entire world is galvanized toward that objective. When it appears that huge chunks of the global economy, like the United States, and as far as most people are concerned, China, are unconcerned about their impact on climate, it's very difficult to convince Canadians that they ought to be, isn't it?
Yeah, that has been the eternal challenge, right? You've seen it as recently as, I think within the last month, I read an op-ed that said, well, look, Canada's only 1.4, 1.7% of total world emissions. So why, let's not get carried away here. And the problem, look, there's lots of problems with that argument. And you can try to rebut it with math. I think it is an excuse for inaction. I think, I do wonder whether sort of the electrification you're seeing in other places, the fact that countries like China are acting, whether that eventually compels federal Canadian political action. I do wonder whether, simple economics takes over at some point, and whether if clean energy becomes so cheap that will eventually, just sort of tip this entire discussion. But
so we should be so lucky as a species that greed turns out to be the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That we get bailed out at we get bailed out at the last minute by capitalism. But I do wonder, and look, you would know this better than I as a pollster. Like, I just, as much as the public opinion may be on the side of building things and maybe not worrying so much about climate change, I just don't know at what point that rebounds on you and comes back, and suddenly you need to buttress that side of the argument and show that you have climate credibility. Because as much as, look, as we've said, like, public opinion is on the side of building things. The official opposition isn't pushing the government to do more on climate change. I don't know that means the Carney government has unlimited room to maneuver here to just continue sort of playing down climate policy, because there won't be any losses electorally. It seems like there must be some sort of outer edge at which the public would say, wait a minute, we still do actually care about climate change.
Yeah, I would be curious to see if that would ever happen. I'm kind of skeptical. And I want to take you back to your comment about Joe Biden, because Joe Biden had a very, very different approach to this than the Trudeau government did, and one that I had a lot of, that I found very attractive, because he wasn't asking people to make any sacrifices. Okay? And the Trudeau policy was all about buy this car, don't buy that car, don't do that, do this, and all that stuff, and about behavioral change and top-down led behavioral change. My minor experience with the deficit in the 90s led me to believe that people won't sacrifice for apprehended problems, and that asking them to is a fool's errand. And so I used to argue with people on the show, representatives of the government, who would say that the carbon price was fine politically because they'd gotten elected on it. And I would say, well, as soon as it is large enough to make a difference, it will be unpopular. And I think that's I don't think that's genius. I think that's an ironclad rule of politics. So the Carney government makes another argument about climate change, which is that the aggregate impact of all that they're building is going to make Canada a lower emissions country that is more electrified and more clean electricity, that you have to look at their policy in its entirety as opposed to just its oil and gas policy. And I am attracted to the notion of fighting climate change without asking people to sacrifice, because I think that's politically durable. People will not sacrifice. So, after that long preamble, what do you think?
I could write like a 1,000-page book on the carbon price and the carbon tax, because it is, I think there was a feeling after 2021, the 2021 election, where the Conservatives ran on a carbon. Yeah, where the Conservatives ran on a carbon price. Liberals won. They'd won now two straight elections with the carbon price existing. That the fight was over. Like, the battle has been won. The war over carbon price is over. And then inflation happened. And I don't think, it's unclear. I think you could debate whether the carbon price was actually adding a lot to the cost that Canadians were bearing at that moment. But it was a convenient point of to blame and to say, well, things cost too much. This costs something. Let's get rid of it. And there was a lot of, I think there was a bit of looking at what Biden was doing, and you could look at that and say, oh, that's a much better way to do it. At least politically. Economically, fiscally, people would say it's still way more expensive. It's still going to cost you more money in the long run. It makes way more sense to do a carbon tax, and you have to, I guess, wonder whether if it had been possible to do a carbon tax in the U.S., whether they would have gone down that route. Politically, legislatively, it just wasn't possible. But I do think there's something to be said for what you're saying, that the Carney government's approach that is less based on regulation could prove to be more durable, could prove to be more politically saleable. I think it does still, though, come back to like, okay, well, show the math exactly. Like, the Climate Institute is eventually going to come out with some numbers that show us where we're at for the future projection of emissions. And I think if the Carney government can't show what the track to net zero looks like, I wonder how that plays politically. Not that the Canadian electorate's going to look at the Climate Institute numbers and say, oh, okay, this is going to dictate how I'm going to vote in the next election. But is there some kind of penalty for looking like you're not serious on climate change if you can't show what it looks like going forward?
I bet there's no electoral penalty. But there may be a big penalty because it feels like we're negotiating with nature. You know, it feels like the scientists have told us, well, you have to reduce emissions to this level by this, or this happens, and we're going, well, we can't do it by that date, but what if we do it by this date? But it feels to me like that's going to end badly. I hope the scientists are wrong.
I do, yeah. I do think, Jordan said it on your pod, and I do think it, every time there's
I'm
a
going
new
to take note, by the way, that you only quote Jordan.
Well, look, when she's right, she's right. Every time there's a wildfire season, I think to myself, like, how is this going to register with the Canadian public? Because, like, I know personally, having when there were smoky days in Ottawa, it hits you in a different way than abstract conversations about climate change.
I was in the field last year when the wildfire smoke was covering Manhattan. Right? And no, did not move the numbers again.
Yeah, that is the flip side, is that people have been kind of waiting, like, well, when the impacts hit, that's when public opinion will change. And it's not clear that that's going to happen.
What is that,
and
when
I think
Miami is underwater? Like what?
Yeah, what it'll take. And I think the other danger, and again, I'm not an expert in public opinion, but just in the abstract, the other danger I would worry about is, does it come a point where people go, well, like, we're screwed. This is the new reality. There's no point in cutting emissions. We might as well just adapt. But yeah, I do think, I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I still do wonder whether there's at some point some political price to be paid. Not that it's going to swing an election, but is this the opening? This is, probably expecting too much maybe, but like, is this the opening, for instance, for something like the NDP to get a foothold back in Canadian politics if the Carney government doesn't look serious on climate policy?
Should be worth a few points. Right.
So maybe you win Davenport back in downtown Toronto or something.
Well, I don't want to write off a seat yet. Aaron, this was tremendous. Thanks for this conversation. Really enjoyed
Anytime.
it. Thanks. And by the way, thanks for your work at the CBC. Your coverage of Canadian politics is outstanding and essential for my daily life.
You're far too kind.
A little update here. A happy update, I'd say. A few weeks ago, on May 3rd, thousands of cyclists and walkers showed up in Ottawa to raise money for pediatric cancer patients at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, which is the worthiest of worthy causes. And our sponsor, CN, was proud to be there alongside them. They raised $2.25 million and counting, a record. It will go to cancer research and treatment and to make life more comfortable for CHEO's young oncology patients. I want to mention a few of the event's heroes. The top fundraiser was Team Carpe Diem, the extended family of Beckett Both and his cousin, Lucy Carr. Last January, in a 24-hour span, 2-year-old Beckett and 4-year-old Lucy were diagnosed with leukemia and kidney cancer, respectively. Lucy rang the bell in September, leaving CHEO cancer-free. Beckett's journey continues. CHEO has become his second home, and help from the CHEO Foundation has made treatment more bearable for the children and their family. The second most prodigious fundraiser was Tammy Bell and her family, who walked in memory of her son Griffin, who was diagnosed at 16 months of age with neuroblastoma. He fought for 5 years, but relapsed twice, and the Bell family lost him last year. They have become some of the strongest supporters of the CN cycle for CHEO. There are so many others. Michael Meehan, a 19-year-old who, with CHEO's help, beat cancer 3 times during his childhood. Or Piers Corsi, the 6-year-old who was diagnosed as an infant and confirmed cancer-free in 2023. Piers rode his own bike on May 3rd. He and his family raised $8,400. I could go on, but I won't. What I will say is this. You don't have to wait for a fundraising event to support CHEO and lend a hand to brave kids dealing with surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. It's easy to find the CN Cycle for CHEO website. Be generous. Like I said, the worthiest of worthy causes. All right, Rick Smith, good to see you. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. It's a sunny day here in Toronto.
Is it warm by any chance?
Yeah, it's warming up. So, clearly this climate change thing is taking hold.
Well, I'm outside of Ottawa, and there is no evidence of it today. But that, as we know, is not the real barometer. Thanks for joining me. I wanted to have a conversation with you about the the climate implications of particularly the Memorandum of Understanding signed between Alberta and Ottawa, but any other changes that are ancillary to that or related to that as well. And I guess maybe I'll start by saying I know that you are unhappy about the the industrial price level and the phase-in period for it. Before we get into that, is there anything else you like or don't like about this package?
Well, it's been a busy couple of weeks, right? I mean, you've touched on this, I think, in the last Curse of Politics. I mean, there's been a lot of announcements shooting out the door in Ottawa. So we're still trying to take a look at the sum total of all of this. The national electricity strategy matters a lot. We were generally positive about that. There's some things, I think, some things to consider in that package of changes to impact assessment, some bad ideas in that package. So there's been a few big announcements in a couple of weeks, and these are all kind of related.
Right. What's the bad thing you were referencing?
Well, in the package of impact assessment changes, there's this notion of giving federal cabinet essentially complete jurisdiction over some big decisions. And, I wouldn't want to be sitting in a federal cabinet that has to decide whether to snuff out, an endangered population of killer whales. I mean, that seems contrary to common sense. And, I doubt that would stand up in court. I mean, of course, we think it's important. We agree with the government that we need to build some big things in this country. That's the only way we're going to decarbonize our economy. For sure, let's take a look at some common sense regulatory changes to get there, but short-circuiting due process, trying to compress every process into something meaningless, I think is actually a recipe to bog things down in the long term.
Can we stress test that for just a second?
Like
Can we go on about that? So I was having this conversation with Aaron Wherry about the genesis of the Trudeau government's environmental policies, climate policies, which were not, the stated purpose at least at the beginning, was not to produce less oil or to not have pipelines. It was quite the opposite. They felt that a proper set of processes would create the social license to build pipelines that the Harper government had been unable to build through force majeure. And so, but that really didn't work, that theory, did it? And so if we're going to build these things, are we actually back to a place where you need to have a more directive approach to it?
Well, let's take a specific example that you've actually talked about on your show before, which is, let's take a look at what's happening with the the proposed Alto high-speed rail project. Yeah. As soon as the potential route's announced, communities up and down that route are starting to organize. They want to be heard. I think that project is a great idea, by the way, but this is within the context. I mean, community organizing around that project is happening right now in the context of the process that we have right now, even in advance of significant environmental assessment hearings and the like. So I think very unlikely that if you try to compress these processes even further, if you try to short-circuit consultation with First Nations, for instance, what's going to happen is that people are going to get angrier, and these things are going to wind up bogged down in court. So trying to go too quickly is a recipe for grinding things to a halt. That's not to say that some alignment, for instance, between federal and provincial processes doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. The core of what slows down a lot of things in our country is our federal system. There's only a handful of federal countries on the planet. We're one of them, where these things are a shared jurisdiction. It's just a fact of life. Of course that makes sense, but, completely eliminating processes, giving that decision-making entirely to the federal cabinet, for instance, is a recipe for disaster and just for further dysfunction.
Okay. So now let's flash forward to this MOU in particular. The industrial carbon price is being decried by oil industry people as an uncompetitive charge on their business. And people are asserting that we will not get the production required to justify another pipeline, nor will we get a pipeline proponent necessarily unless we drop this industrial carbon price issue. And you've made the opposite case, and I know it because I've read it in the advertisements on this show.
Yes.
That the current cost is absolutely inconsequential, but even if it got up to the levels of $130, it would be the cost per barrel of a Timbit.
Correct.
Right? Now, put that way, it sounds inconsequential, but they're shipping a lot of barrels of oil. Does it become consequential? And how can it not be if no other country has one that we're competing against? Why wouldn't having one be a deterrent to investment?
Yeah. Well, let's just start with the fact that the Canadian oil and gas industry quite frequently makes the argument that Canadian oil and gas is the best in the world, the most virtuous, the greenest. I mean, these are explicit claims by the industry. So being supportive of a policy that is unbelievably affordable for the industry, in many cases makes companies money if they pollute below the specified threshold, that would seem to be the least that these companies should do to make good on their own daily claims that Canadian oil and gas is the best in the world. And then if we look at let's take a look at what some of our competitors are doing in the world. What are some other countries that are big oil and gas producers? What are they doing? Saudi Arabia, biggest producer in the world, spending untold billions of dollars trying to bring down their emissions per barrel of oil through production efficiencies and the like. You see big oil and gas producing countries like Norway, the UK. They actually have industrial carbon prices up and running. So this notion that a Canadian industrial carbon price is anomalous in the world, incorrect. The notion that it's unaffordable for Canadian industry, just not based in fact. Just to nuance what you mentioned a couple minutes ago, David, according to our calculations, the average cost per Canadian oil producing facility is would be the equivalent of a Timbit per barrel once the price rises to $130 a ton.
Right.
But many facilities would actually are actually making money from this thing, because the whole way the system's designed, if you pollute below the threshold, you generate credits that you can sell. If you pollute above that threshold, companies that pollute above that threshold have to buy those credits to even the playing field. So a Timbit per barrel is the average cost. Lots of companies are making money from this thing. So all in all, this is a very reasonable policy invented in the province of Alberta, supported for many years by the Canadian oil and gas industry. It was actually working. Our competitors many of them are doing something similar. So it's with all of that said, we were hoping for more from these MOU negotiations.
Right. You were hoping for a higher price kicking in earlier, correct?
Not only that, that's part of it. We thought reaching a level of $130 a ton by 2030 was reasonable. Again, average cost would be a Timbit a barrel for these oil producers, no big deal. But we were also hoping for a few deeply geeky, wonky technical changes to these carbon credit markets to fix some of the dysfunction in these markets. So just to mention one thing, over the past few years, because of systematic glitches introduced to these carbon markets by provinces like Alberta, there's been this widening gap between the advertised price of carbon credits that the governments trumpet and the actual price that these credits are trading at on exchanges. That gap's been widening. And so we had a few kind of technical suggestions for how to narrow that gap.
That's actually part of the government's argument, isn't it, Rick? That they're replacing a higher price, a theoretically stronger program that was not working, with some theoretically weaker program that's actually going to work.
Well, so it didn't please me to be able to do this, but we were able to say we told you so when this happened, because going back to the end of last year, the government of Alberta actually legislated further damaging changes to its carbon credit markets a few days after signing the MOU with the federal government,
Right.
which then tanked the credit markets. And it seems in these negotiations between Alberta and the federal government, it was that kind of artificially depressed lower price that was the starting point for negotiation, which just rewards transparent bad behavior and doesn't get these credit markets anywhere near where they need to be. So just with some real numbers here, today in the European Union, carbon credits are trading for about 120 bucks Canadian a ton. Today in the United Kingdom, carbon credits are trading at about 85 bucks Canadian a ton. So the thought that our aspiration or our requirement for these markets would be 130 bucks a ton 15 years from now just puts us wildly out of whack with where global credit markets are headed.
Right. What is the significance of all this in the bigger picture of climate change in the globe? I'm trying to figure out why a Canadian should care about this, Rick. Given all that's going on, the Trump policies in the States, China, what they're doing, and all the variables on climate change, what matters about this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the size of our economy, the size of our how much we emit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, Canada's the 11th biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. There's 195 countries in the world. We're number 11 in terms of what we pump out every year. So there's an important argument here that we need to contribute to the solution of this global problem in the same way that we've contributed to the war in Ukraine or
Right.
Other significant international efforts, international problem-solving moments in the past. I'd also say that there's still a tendency, except on your show, David, where your discussions are more well-rounded than I'm about to describe. But there's a tendency with climate change stuff to still think about this as all cost. That all of this is a kind of a penalty that we need to pay as Canadians or as citizens, and of course the flip side of that's increasingly important, and you talked to Michael Liebreich about this a few months ago, is that decarbonization is the name of the game as a driver of industrial strategy, of significant new investment, of capital flows globally. So you see, China is intent on dominating electric vehicle production. Of course, electric vehicles are increasingly winning in markets all over the world, except at the moment in Canada and the United States. China's intent on winning on critical mineral mining, battery production, everything that batteries, every machine that batteries go into these days. I mean, these are the consumer items, the machines, the industrial processes that are going to dominate the economy increasingly, that are winning in markets all over the world. And as Canadians, if we want to succeed economically in the future, we got to get there first. We got to get our elbows up and we got to compete. And so good climate change policies, good decarbonization policies that provide incentives for those new investments, that provide structures for our chartered banks and our big asset owners to get in the game here, that's all important. So that the climate change discussion is not where it was at a decade ago, where nobody drove an electric vehicle, very few people were buying heat pumps, solar panels cost a lot of money, windmills didn't work that great. There's a technology curve here that's related to climate change that we need to win at as Canadians. And so coming back to industrial carbon pricing, this policy was designed, again, in Alberta originally, to both reduce emissions and to enhance the competitiveness of Canadian industry. An increasing number of our trading partners around the world are implementing industrial carbon prices. Not only that, they are creating carbon border tariffs to penalize their trading partners that have industrial carbon prices that they deem non-equivalent with their systems. So it's not an exaggeration to say that a functional, effective industrial carbon price, as one example, is the price of admission for global trade these days, and that will increasingly be the case in the years ahead.
Public services are the heart of what makes Canada the country it is. Public service workers keep our food safe, respond when disasters strike, and support families, students, and veterans. Building a strong Canada starts with protecting one of our nation's greatest resources, our public services. Learn how at foryoucanada.ca. This message was paid for by the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
Whose oil is being turned away because it's not produced properly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, again, first of all, our own industry says all the time that Canadian oil is the best in the world, the greenest in the world. So there's a certain amount of, okay, let's put our money where our mouth is in that regard.
Right.
Otherwise, it's like the height of false advertising. At the moment, international oil markets, especially in the wake of disruption from the Strait of Hormuz, are not differentiating between greener or less green oil. I think we see a lot of our trading partners, Saudi Arabia is one example, spending a lot of time and money trying to bring down the emissions per barrel of their oil, because obviously they foresee a future in a world with worsening climate change effects. I mean, let's think about how hot the world is going to be, how significant droughts are going to be globally 10, 20 years from now from climate change. There's a directionality to the damage that climate change is doing that's going to become more and more alarming in the next few decades, that is going to drive some policy changes, some policy acceleration in ways I don't think that we can even anticipate now in the next few decades. And many of our trading partners, like Saudi Arabia, are trying to get ahead of their ahead of that curve, banking on the fact that in a world dominated by climate change effects, that there will be a premium for greener oil as this transition occurs in later decades. So, I think it's sitting on our butts and trying to ignore all of this,
Right.
and not keeping up with what our trading partners are doing seems to me a really risky strategy, an unnecessarily risky strategy. A better play would be for our oil and gas sector to try to get ahead of this, with reasonable, well-designed policies like industrial carbon pricing.
Is that not what the carbon capture and storage component of this is? And I understand that it's related. You need to have a price on carbon for you to want to mitigate it. So
Yeah.
That's the relationship between the two things. But I mean, the Prime Minister has insisted, the government has insisted that at a minimum this carbon capture and storage piece be part of it. That's something I don't think is being done elsewhere. And I know that there's a great deal of skepticism about this technology in certain quarters. I don't know what you think. about it. But how effective do you expect this to be in? Because I think at times in the past I've heard the Prime Minister say things that reflect this. The last barrel of oil is sold is going to be a low emissions intense barrel of oil. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably a concept the government agrees with and are trying to address through this carbon capture thing, maybe?
Yeah. Well, listen, we believe the International Energy Agency's forecasts over the next few decades that shows an increasing role for carbon capture and storage. You do see lots of activity globally on this front, lots of capital interested in this globally. We're a little bit puzzled by the treatment of the so-called Pathways project in this MOU. It's probably the aspect of the MOU that's least developed. The pipeline seems to have lots of specific dates attached. This Pathways project, not so much.
Okay.
You're quite right. There is a relationship between, the primary method of funding a carbon capture project would be a functional industrial carbon price. So to the extent that the government has just set up, a kind of disappointingly weak, pokey industrial carbon price, it's hard for us to understand how that's going to assist the standing up this Pathways project. The history of the Pathways discussion is interesting. Just go back a year or 2 years. The biggest proponent of this thing was the oil sands industry. They actually had a big thing on their website. They had maps, they had charts, they had specific megaton reduction estimates associated with this thing in terms of emission reduction. So the oil sands industry has thought a lot about this thing for many years. So I think the moment has arrived where their bluff is being called, and they're gonna have to move one way or the other.
Is your objective for a carbon price to force the oil industry to be more, to be less emissions intensive and to reduce the amount of emissions attached to the production of a barrel of oil? Or do you want to produce fewer barrels of oil? Because I was reading, and I'm no expert, as you know, I was reading that Norway has a very robust carbon price and record production of oil. Like, it is not seemingly impacting the amount of oil they produce. Now, there's offsetting policies, I gather. But I'm just kind of interested in what is the point here? Is the point to produce oil more efficiently, or is the point is the point to produce less oil?
Yeah. The point is to create an incentive for Canadian industry to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, to create a reasonable, effective, workable system that's in line with other trading partners. So this notion that nobody else does this in the world is just nonsense, it's just, as you just said. The point is to create an incentive for Canadian industry to...
When I say nobody, I mean the states, right?
Well, but even then, that's not quite right, is it? Because if California were an independent country, it'd be the 8th largest economy in the world, and it's got a carbon pricing system up and running, actually officially linked with the province of Quebec.
And formerly Ontario. I've got
Yes.
scars related to this.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just back up one step as well from this question of a big reason that our institute has been so focused on this industrial carbon price is because this is a national policy. This is a policy that is meant to, or that does, apply to every province, to every Canadian industry that qualifies. This is not just a thing about Alberta or the oil industry in Alberta. So there's something fundamentally backward has happened here in the last few months, and we flagged this when the MOU was first signed late last year. There's something fundamentally weird about the fact that this policy, which is the most important climate change policy in Canada, is being driven by one-off discussions with one province. And so we already see other provinces like British Columbia, for instance, putting up their hand after this deal was signed a week ago, saying, okay, wait a minute, hello. Alberta now has this new deal with a decreased carbon price. Meanwhile, the price trajectory in BC is higher than that. We'd like that same deal too, please. And so actually in the last couple of days, you see the federal government being explicit about the fact that this deal that Alberta's got, they're now going to roll out to other provinces, which in many cases is going to mean a step backwards on industrial carbon pricing in other provinces. So the point of this thing is to reduce emissions, David. It is not to impact Canadian production, whether it's in the oil industry or the natural gas industry or any other, the steel industry, the aluminum industry, any other heavy emitting industry that this policy applies to.
But the whole policy as it was set up, I think, under the previous government, under the Trudeau government, had an element of sacrifice to it that I think Canadians ultimately rejected, Rick, which was we have to have industrial policies that generate less money than could be optimally generated. We have to have a carbon tax that makes us pay money if we're not doing the right things. That there was an element of there is a price to be paid for fighting climate change, and we need to pay it. I'm not aware of other jurisdictions that are asking people to perform to do that. I mean, like the United States has no, as a federal government, has no carbon policy, but for a while under Biden, it was all carrot. They had a policy, but it was all carrot. It was no stick, right? You talk about Saudi Arabia. They're investing in how to lower emissions, but that's probably not something that costs the ordinary person something. I'm wondering whether there's examples around the world where countries have said, you have to be poorer now so that we can be better later.
Yeah. Well, again, let's just take a look at how many countries around the world have similar industrial carbon prices. China, it's they're growing their carbon markets, growing the scope of their carbon markets. India, the European Union, the UK, dozens of other countries around the world, many U.S. states. So an increasing amount of global GDP is actually covered by carbon markets very similar to Canada's. Another point here, David, really important underline. The intersection of industrial carbon pricing, or the exposure of industrial carbon pricing to Canadian consumers, is zero, because this is a policy that applies primarily to exporting industries, to heavy emitting industries like the steel industry, the aluminum industry. So we've actually looked at this really closely, and the impact of the effect of industrial carbon pricing on Canadian consumers is zilch, right? Different than it was a couple of years ago, where industrial carbon pricing and consumer carbon pricing were sort of bound up together. And of course, the Carney government over a year ago got rid of consumer carbon pricing. So all we're left with is this industrial aspect that only applies to the biggest, heaviest emitting industries in the country. So there's no aspect of deprivation or sacrifice here. This is about a policy that incents best-in-class behavior by Canadian industries. And so if they bring down their levels of pollution, they actually make money out of this system. And by our calculations, tens of billions of dollars of investment across the country are bound up in these credit markets, are being funded by these credit markets. So it's resulting in good economic activity happening across the country.
You know what would be more credible than you saying that? A business person. Where are the business people making these arguments?
Well, there's lots of them.
Are there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've done lots of work with chartered banks on this topic. We actually work very closely with.
Are those the people that all pulled out of the GFANS initiative?
Yeah, some of them. That's different. Different thing. We can talk about that. But we work very closely. Just as one example, we work very closely with the cement and concrete industry. That industry really vocally supportive of industrial carbon pricing. They've deputed in the last couple of months to standing committees on Parliament Hill. They talk about it a lot. The aluminum industry in Canada, very supportive of industrial carbon pricing. Why? Because Canadian aluminum is really some of the greenest in the world. And in a world where carbon is measured and tracked, and aluminum industries in other countries who pollute more have to pay more in terms of carbon credits. That actually materially benefits the Canadian aluminum industry. So there's actually there's lots of industrial leaders out there, leaders in the financial sector, that have been in the past quite vocally supportive of carbon pricing.
Right. I think my last question, Rick, is this: as somebody that really actually,
I'm cautious of the fact that whenever I talk about industrial carbon pricing, including with you, that it's possibly the least sexy topic in the world, and that.
And normally this is a dead sexy show. Normally this is, really titillating. Don't worry, you're doing great. But my question is quite a serious one, which is, I consider myself an ally of the climate movement. I consider myself somebody that has been concerned about this, tried to understand it, been supportive of efforts to deal with it. But as I watch the world politically, I understand that there's a lot of stuff happening by market forces, that a lot of emissions reduction is going on because it makes economic sense now to do it, that solar is cheaper and wind is cheaper, and these things are becoming big deals. So I'm not saying nothing's happening, but politically it feels like nobody's doing anything anymore. And it feels like the Paris targets are not going to be met, and nobody really cares about that. And so I'm trying to find my bearings. Like, what are our objectives right now? What are we trying to do?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make you a bet. And I don't know what we'll bet here. We'll bet a beer or maybe a delicious bottle of scotch or something. But I'm going to make you a bet that we're going to be having a really different discussion about climate change. It's going to start November 5th, November 4th, the day after the U.S. midterms, when the Democrats pick up steam, which they seem likely to do, and things are going to really change after the next U.S. presidential election a couple of years from now, when if the Democrats win, they're going to.
If there's an election.
If there's an election.
Yeah.
They've got a different kind of climate change progress that revolves around clean electricity. A lot of the things we're talking about baked into their offering. So I would argue that the two biggest things impacting the climate discussion today. One is on the negative side. His name is Donald Trump. He has been intent on stymieing any progress on this, picking fights with states that want to stay the course. But then on the positive side of things are these technological trends we've been talking about. The fact that solar panels are cheaper than ever. 75, in the last 12 months, if you look at new electricity installation around the world, 75% of new electricity installation around the world was solar installations, not renewables. Solar alone was 75% of new electricity around the world, not because of any sort of virtuous reason, but because solar is so cheap and it's gotten so good and it's the best deal. It's the best deal going. So, Donald Trump, to a large extent, has derailed this discussion on this continent, made things quite difficult for us in Canada. But if you look at what's happening in China, in India, India is overperforming dramatically in terms of its renewable energy installation. China has fused its climate change policy with an effective industrial strategy. Europe in 1 year alone has dramatically reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. So at the moment, we live in this weird. We live in this kind of cul-de-sac of this debate called North America. Meanwhile, things are really moving in the rest of the world, and I think we're going to start catching up in the next couple of years.
Great. Thanks very much, Rick. I'm sure we'll talk again, but it was great to get an update from you on this particular element of the journey. We'll check back.
I hope to win. I look forward to winning that bet.
All right, I'll take the scotch. Andrew, great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. Bucket list podcast for me.
my honor to have you on. Your work is very substantial and very influential. So I appreciate the time you're giving us today. Um, Maybe I want to talk to you about the economics around energy, and in particular around oil, and in the context of the pipeline and the MOU with Alberta. Maybe we could start by just a little level setting. What has been the economic impact of the Trans Mountain Pipeline to Canada?
I mean, the economic impact, it's really hard to put a dollar value on it. I mean, you start with just the major project impact. We built a $30 billion pipeline. So that's all the things you usually talk about that economists get riled up about of, economic impacts. It's not a better pipeline because we spent more money, but that did translate to real on the ground impacts for people in construction. So fine. The biggest impact though is that in the alternative, you would have had a very constrained pipeline network. We would have had massive differentials to Canadian oil. So every barrel of oil that we export, every barrel of oil that we use domestically would have been essentially undervalued because of that constrained pipeline network. So you're talking about, $5 to $10 a barrel probably on not just what goes through the pipeline, but on that 5 million barrels a day or 4.5 million barrels a day of Western Canadian production. So huge leverage from adding that capacity. And then maybe I'll add one thing, which is, before that pipeline went into service, our major crude oil export port was the U.S. Gulf Coast. We were exporting more barrels off the U.S. Gulf Coast. Rory Johnson developed those numbers than we were anywhere else. And this has shifted our exports more towards our own sovereign control, which I think has proven to be much more important than we might have thought when we were building that pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. It was only financial at that point. It wasn't really sovereignty driven.
Yeah.
So, do you think a new pipeline would double that, or is there some increment? What's the benefit of another one?
Well, I mean, as we see Trans Mountain right now, we're getting very close to operating at capacity. So as you get closer to that operating at capacity, then every barrel risks that same idea happening. Traffic gets congested. We get those differentials that blow out. And assuming that people continue adding production, which seems likely at this point, then you're going to be back to a world where we're going to be selling our barrels at a larger discount than we need to. The question really, for me, isn't how much or whether we need new pipeline capacity, it's how much. And now that you have Enbridge in the system, you have the sort of Keystone XL back from the dead for the 60th time under a different name. And then you have this potential for Trans Mountain expansion, and you have potential for a new pipeline. It's at what point do we go from giving ourselves options and giving ourselves a free-flowing network to overbuilding that system? And so somewhere between, Premier Smith's visions of pipelines in every direction and where we are right now is the right number. I'm not quite sure where that is.
But based on what you've said, a pipeline to the West Coast would be of significantly more economic and sovereignty benefit than the Keystone Pipeline would be.
100%. I mean, Keystone's or now Bridger/Prairie Connector. It's an easier pipeline to build. I mean, if you've driven from Alberta south, and I mean, you know some of the route very well. But that's easier terrain to build a pipeline through. It has easier probably politics to build a pipeline other than the history of Keystone XL. But if we want pipeline that we control and that gives our producers real options to the highest value crude market and the fastest growing crude market in the world, then you go west.
So why are we having trouble finding somebody who wants to build it?
I mean, the biggest thing is you have that uncertainty of, well, two things, I guess. You have the political approval that currently sits at the end of our process. So that's been in since, from 1949, where we've had the final sign off is at the cabinet level. But the Trudeau decision on Gateway brought that to the forefront. And we'd seen that in the US as well. And then the second thing is the uncertainty that keeps building over the duty to consult and accommodate First Nations interests, the ability for that pipeline to be held up in the courts for a long period of time, and the uncertain, we know a little bit more after TMX, but there's still a lot of uncertainty there. And so if you're a private investor, you say, okay, I'm going to put up all the dollars to do the regulatory work. I want to know who's bearing that risk, and I want to know, can I get a return on that investment? And if there's decent chance that I will lose the ability to build that pipeline at all, then it's really hard to justify the overall investment. And, I liken it with your producer to saying, you're going to buy a new house or you're thinking of buying a new house. Would you put the money into the kitchen reno before the deal closes? You say, well, if I get this house, yeah, I really want the kitchen reno, but the investment doesn't make sense until you know you're going to own the house. And that's a little bit where where the proponents are. They're going to put up all this money to do the regulatory work under that sort of looming uncertainty that that project might never happen. And it's that chunk that makes it really challenging.
And so the assurances of the Premier and the Prime Minister don't satisfy that?
I mean, I think we saw this with Prime Minister Trudeau even on Trans Mountain, right? The original approval of Trans Mountain, we had the gateway process. We thought we knew what was required. You had very strong support, press conference with all of the government ministers, very strong support for that pipeline project. And yet, from that point forward, you ended up mired in legal uncertainty. You ended up with a very risky situation. Now, thankfully, in that case, you had the government with the political will to get that project to the finish line, but still at multiples of the original budget and under the ownership of a Crown Corp that was able to take on the added risk. If that pipeline had stayed in private sector hands, it's probably not built today.
You suspect that we can sell that to the private sector at a reasonable price? I mean, I know that the costs exploded on TMX, and maybe that's inherent to government building it, but I've heard people speculate that these things in the future are going to have to be built by government and then maybe sold to the private sector.
It's possible that the government, especially as the risk is political and sort of nation to nation in terms of negotiations with Indigenous peoples, it's entirely possible that the only party that can take that upfront risk is going to be a government or quasi-government or an organization with significant Crown backing. So maybe that's the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Corp. Maybe it's federal Crown Corp, the TMX structure. But it is going to be pretty hard, especially for going to the West Coast with that big chunk of pipeline to build, for someone to say, I'm going to take that full risk on, myself or as a consortium of investors. It's going to be pretty hard.
Okay, there's one risk that you haven't mentioned, and that is I talk to smart people who know a lot about the economy, who tell me that over the lifetime of this pipeline, it doesn't make any sense, that the amount of oil that is consumed in the world is peaking and going to reduce, and that the reason the private sector doesn't want to build this is because they can do the math.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a long-term question about the growth in total oil consumption. I think what I worry more about is price than consumption, right? When you think about that period of 2015 to 2019 or 20, which is universally a terrible period for the oil market and for Alberta, in that period, we were consuming more oil globally year after year after year. And so it's not the consumption that matters, it's how much supply is available in the world and how that balances with changes in consumption. So, I think we're still in like most outlooks, other than the ones that have the most stringent of global action on climate change, are ones that maintain an oil price that is consistent with more Alberta production. Now, there is a world in which, this goes badly, but that's true of just about anything. And so I think, you have the lion's share of the investment being under the private sector. They're the one that risk they're happy to take on. The risks that they're not happy to take on are the ones where it's a political decision that they have no real ability to weigh that risk or figure out what it is.
Where does oil fit in the energy mix in terms of people's desire to invest in it right now? So the smart money, wherever that is, the big money, the institutional investors, when they sit around and talk about energy, where are they putting their money?
I think it really depends on who you're talking to. So, but certainly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen the global energy conversation change dramatically. So that's true of institutional investors. It's true of pension funds. It's true of insurance companies. Think of the initiative that Prime Minister Carney led during his time at the Bank of England, and
Beef
how
hands.
that's changed. Yeah, that we've seen that kind of realization. Number one, that the world is much more dependent on oil than maybe people were willing to acknowledge, that it was harder to transition away than people were willing to acknowledge, and that the degree to which we haven't been able to section Russian oil out of the system, I think takes a little bit away from the idea that there was going to be a massive penalty for carbon intensive oil. So one of the things, you go back to Trans Mountain, there was a point where they said, if we have to disclose who our insurer is, we can't insure this pipeline. And I don't think that's true today. But it certainly was true in that sort of pre-COVID into early 2020s era, but that's really shifted away. In terms of the who's making bets on, long-term bets on oil, I think you still see people on either side of that bet, but it is on the long-term price question. It's not just on the, it's not as much on the social desirability. Right now, we can produce more oil more cheaply than we ever would have imagined. So that's, I think, part of the equation, right? Where the idea that we're at 105 million barrels a day with, two multiple war fronts in the Middle East and a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, and we're probably still below what people would have forecast just for baseline oil prices maybe a decade ago with that kind of quantity. So we have just more cheap oil everywhere in the world right now than we thought was possible. And same is true of gas.
That doesn't sound necessarily positive for us.
It's not. I mean, I think this is part of what, I wrote a piece for IRPP not too long ago about pipelines, where I said, look, this is the major change that people ignore that's happened in the world since 2014, 15, is that those long run oil price expectations have dropped dramatically. Now, they haven't dropped enough to drive oil sands out of complete favor, but before we had the current wartime situation, remember, we were talking about, $50s or $60 oil as maybe the new normal. And that's certainly, it's your oil sands are still viable there. And even new projects, the best new projects are still viable, but you're getting into a territory where it's more questionable than it would be at the prices we're seeing right now.
So TMX cost about $30 billion to build, right? Am I right?
Yes, that's a little
That's
over.
a lot of money. There's a tremendous amount of money. So even in the context of the sums that are being talked about in terms of the rebuild and the money the government set aside for infrastructure, et cetera, it's a big sum of money. Is there an opportunity cost to putting $30 billion into an oil pipeline? Like, what if we put $30 billion into electrification?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an opportunity cost both in the financial, but also in the political. I mean, I'm more on your lawn here, but the political capital that's going to have to be spent by the Carney government to enable a new pipeline, just as we saw with Prime Minister Trudeau's government. But I think there's also a probably larger, actually, I definitely think there's a larger opportunity cost to walking away from the prospect of this pipeline. Because you're going to have that not only in Alberta, people feeling this way, but I think you're going to have across Canada. That the question is there right now of, is this government committed to enabling the types of projects that would enable economic activity, that would enable prosperity? And I don't think there's any doubt about the prosperity that's been enabled by oil and gas development in Canada over time. And if you have a government that says, you know what, this is not what we're interested in doing, a mine here, whatever project there. But when the big hard stuff comes, I think it was a Jerry Buttsism to say hard things are hard. But when the really hard stuff comes, but with a big opportunity, that you say, I don't know if we're willing to put that kind of a bet down. I think that would be harmful.
What I'm kind of skirting around here, Andrew,
Yeah.
Is this an important economic policy, or is this an important political policy? I know it's an important political policy. It has become a litmus test in the country about whether Canada works for Alberta. So that, I get that. Okay? But it's also kind of become a litmus test about whether Canada works. And I'm asking you whether that's legitimate.
And I think it is. I think the idea that you have, why do we come together as a confederation of provinces? Why do we have certain things that are reserved for the federal government, including works and undertakings that cross provincial borders? It's because we don't want that hold up problem. I mean, we don't want that idea that any one part of the country can hold another part of the country's production or value hostage.
Please
And
tell
we
that
do,
to Newfoundland. They would be
yes,
quite
well,
surprised to hear that we had such a principle in this
they,
country.
they sure, I guess we heard a lot about that last week. But yeah, and again, if the federal government took its responsibilities to deal with interprovincial works and undertakings to include interprovincial electricity transmission in the same way we have with pipelines, then yeah, you probably have a different story with electricity from Newfoundland and Labrador. But I think if we want Canada to work, I think you do need that opening of interprovincial trade. You need the ability to build stuff that enables high value production, as opposed to, now we're having this, it's like the tail wagging the dog. We have this massive resource in Alberta, and all of the conversation is around the infrastructure to deliver it, right? We've really, and if you think you see that in some other places, right? The access to the Ring of Fire, but I don't think it's the same. We don't really have that conversation where this is your litmus test for, are you an environmentalist? Do you care about climate change? Are you a pro-development or anti-development politician, et cetera? Are you pro-free trade or anti-free trade? This has become a litmus test for a lot of things. But I think assuming that we see a legitimate project come forward, we don't know the details yet. Assuming that you have commercial support, signing of shipping arrangements, so long-term contracting on that pipeline, then I think it would be a shame if you had, but we, for essentially political reasons, we can't get this thing built. I think that would send a bad signal about Canada.
What do you think about this carbon capture business that is intended to go alongside the pipeline? In fact, from the federal government's perspective, must go alongside the pipeline. I'll start by saying I'm unclear personally as to whether or not they're insisting on this because they're insisting on a climate offset to the additional emissions from a new pipeline for the purposes of combating climate change, or whether it is an economic argument that has been around for a long time, which is that as demand for oil drops, it will increasing the oil that is lower in emissions intensity will be the oil that is sold. And so if you want to be selling oil at the end of oil, you would be making sure that you were either a low emitting source or you were capturing it through this system. Rambling preamble, what do you think?
Yeah. To me, it has to be the first one. It's the bargain that was put on the table for Canadians by the oil and gas industry, right? This was everyone who watched Hockey Night in Canada saw those ads week after week after week, and I'm sure it was on other things too, saying this is what we're prepared to do. And you talk about this being a political fight, whichever government it is, whether it were a conservative government or a liberal government, they don't just need to convince the people in Alberta that this is a good idea. They need to convince people in Toronto. They need to convince people in Vancouver. They need to convince people in Quebec. And I don't think you do that if it becomes a symbol for we're abandoning our climate change commitments. I could be wrong about that. But, I think this has proven to be a really important piece of the puzzle. The second one, I think, is, as you asked earlier, I think it's lost a little bit of its push. Maybe that was true when you go back to, sort of the Premier Jason Kenney era, even, where we saw a big change in him from his first overseas trips, London, for example, pushing oil sands development. He came back, and the first thing he did when he came back was started an environmental and social governance office in the Alberta government, right? Like, he got a very strong message from the global financial community that this stuff is important. I don't think that's quite as true now. And as I said earlier, we're seeing how much market there is for Russian crude, et cetera. I think the reality is, at least as we see it right now, if crude starts to drop, the low cost producers will have the advantage, not necessarily just the low emissions producers in those remaining markets. But I think it's that buy-in from Canadians, and it's the willingness to get that, political push behind the pipeline, for example, and the new development that it's going to take to get it done.
You say what you say because you can't imagine a world on fire in which people are now obsessed with climate change and combating climate change and getting emissions down and doing whatever people possibly can. Like, I'm having trouble, Andrew, trying to figure out whether I'm living in a fever dream right now or whether 2015 to 2020 was a fever dream. But one of these two things cannot be true. Either this doesn't matter at all and we can just carry on and burn this shit, or it matters a whole lot and the reckoning is coming.
I think so. It's a good question. I think you go back even further, right? I play this game sometimes on social media to say, to very staunch conservative supporters, would you ever vote for a government that would mandate carbon capture and storage in the oil sands or propose like a high industrial carbon price? And they say no. And they say, well, did you vote for Harper in 2006? Well, of course you did. And those things were in their turning the corner plan, 06, 08. And so I think the world will change. Like it's going to ebb and flow a little bit. On the carbon capture and storage question, the only time you're going to get that built is if the oil sands companies believe that their future production hinges on that emissions reduction. And whether it's going to be required by a government or required by markets, that's the only way it gets sanctioned. The nice thing about it is you can do it almost any time. You don't have to link it necessarily. But right now, I just don't think that's there. So I think if we want it today, we're going to have to pay for it. And if we regulate it, you probably don't get the development because the industry, the key people that have to make those investment decisions, they're going to say, give me 2 or 3 years and there'll be a Poilievre government or whoever the next government will be and that world will change. But I think you're right. There's going to be another wave. There's going to be multiple waves of climate policy because that situation's only going to get worse. But how does that manifest in Canada? I don't think we know.
Right. Okay. So you take me then to this industrial carbon tax, which you just mentioned. And so I read ads on my shows, and I had Rick Smith from the Climate Institute say it to me directly in this program that the cost of the industrial carbon tax, as they would have liked it to be, not as it is, as they would have liked it to be, was an inconsequential cost to the oil sector. The price of a timbit per barrel is what they say.
Yep.
So first of all, reality check, is that correct?
Yeah, for today's prices and where they would like it to be, that's absolutely right. After royalties, after taxes, that's the change in the profitability of those facilities.
So is that something that investors would notice?
Not really. Now, again, in context, if you said, if you were an engineer working on an oil sands, so I've had the opportunity to go to a bunch of the research symposia for oil sands companies and stuff. If you came up with something that would save take one of the large oil sands producers 25 cents a barrel or 50 cents a barrel, that's a career-making innovation. So it is, when you take, a larger producer pushing up on 1 million barrels a day at 50 cents a barrel, that's real money in a big hurry. So you don't want to minimize it, but where I think I would flip it around and say, is there any oil sands company that's telling their shareholders that their investments are 25 cents to 50 cents a barrel from not being viable? And there isn't. But that's kind of what they're telling Canadians when it comes to carbon pricing, is they sort of change their tune and say, well, if it went from 25 cents to 50 cents, things would get really dicey and people might invest elsewhere. And that's not what they're telling their shareholders, right? They're telling their shareholders low cost, innovation, stable democracy, stable rules, long-term cash flows. They're answering sort of the question, would you like a little bit lower cost or a little bit higher return on every barrel? And the answer is yes. And that's really where they're pushing right now.
I'm interested because, if I believe that Mark Carney understands anything, I would believe he understands financing. And so he would know what you're talking about. So did he give on that just to get a deal with Smith, or does he have some different idea in mind?
I think what's lost here is a little bit, when we talk about carbon pricing. So Alberta still had a $95 a ton, at least a headline carbon price. Credits were trading in the 30s. But what are Ontario credits trading at? We don't know. What are Quebec credits trading at? They're trading in the 30s. What's the price in Saskatchewan? It's zero. And so if you, as a federal government, the only lever you have in the law is to say we're going to impose the federal price. If you don't meet our benchmarks, we're going to impose the federal price. But they can't do that in Alberta unless they're prepared to do it in Saskatchewan, unless they're prepared to do it potentially in Quebec or change the rules. And then questionable what they would have to do in Ontario. Could they show that Ontario was markedly, higher greenhouse gas emissions price than Alberta? I don't know that they could show that. And so it's not as simple. Like there's some tools that aren't there in Mr. Carney's toolbox that he might like to have there just in that negotiation with Alberta. So Alberta, I think, does it have the ideal carbon pricing system? No, but we were coming into it with something in place that could be worked on, and there was give and take. It got a little bit less stringent than the previous federal benchmark. It's probably more stringent than what would have happened in Alberta absent that. I mean, Premier Smith could have gone the Saskatchewan route and said zero, force it upon us. And if that's what you want. And she didn't take that route. She froze at 95 and introduced some things that weakened the policy a little bit. And now you see some of those things being, strengthened or pushed back towards a stronger policy. So I think there's positives there in terms of what Mr. Carney's delivered, and the Premier Smith has, maybe allowed to happen, if that's the right way to frame it.
So if the tax shouldn't dissuade an investor, what is the point of it?
So that's the industrial carbon price. Essentially what you're trying to do is you're not trying to disadvantage the output. You're trying to make it make financial sense to produce the output at lower emissions. Because if all we do is send oil production or steel or petroleum refining or whatever offshore and then re-import the products, it doesn't help. The climate doesn't help us. And so the idea of that price, with essentially what it does is it gives you credits for every unit of output you produce, and you pay a tax on every unit of emissions. So yes, the average cost is really low, but if you can hold your output constant and reduce your emissions, you save the full value of the carbon price. You save that $95 or heading to $130 per ton. So that's where the math on something like carbon capture and sequestration is a good example. So I can maintain my output. It's a nice kind of figurative way of thinking about it, I guess. I keep my output constant. I clip on this carbon capture unit that can pull my emissions out. And then those emissions don't save you a timbit per barrel. They save you that full value of the emissions price. And so that's where the system tries to maintain production and reduce emissions per unit of production. Where people will criticize it is, I guess, take the opposite tack. And for example, I think Mark Jackard wrote some stuff on this at one point, where he says, but the key issue with oil sands isn't the emissions intensity of current production, it's the scale of production. And so the industrial carbon pricing approach was criticized on that scale, that it actually enabled new investments in new projects, and then it sort of tried to push them at the margin to be a little bit cleaner.
So I was confused because, the consumer carbon tax was designed to change consumer behavior.
So again, it's just designed, but it's analogous to the consumer carbon tax with the rebate. What the consumer carbon tax was meant to do was to make emissions more expensive, but to keep the same amount of dollars roughly in everybody's pocket. So you could spend, but you had a price incentive to spend on cleaner consumption. On the industrial price, it's not keeping them income equivalent. It's basically making them designed to keep them output equivalent. So I don't save money by reducing my output in Canada. I save money by reducing my emissions while maintaining the output.
Among all the political people I talk to who don't know anything about this, there's a growing consensus that the pipeline has to follow the TMX route, that a northern route is not viable politically. Heather Exner-Pirot told me on the podcast that there's a big financial difference between the North, between getting a pipeline to a northern port and following the TMX route. What's your take on that?
I think Heather's right. I think the big financial cost is once you get to the port, can you load barrels directly onto the largest ships? And you cannot do that out of Vancouver. And I mean, there's possibility of doing something offshore in the lower mainland, but that's all hypothetical. So I think, transportation wise, getting to that northern port it's a shorter distance to Asia and you can load the largest ships. So on both of those, and it's actually some of the ports are closer to Edmonton as well. But you do get big advantages from getting there. The question is, can you get there safely by pipeline? So Enbridge ran into that trouble trying to build a pipeline to Prince Rupert. And then, of course, the political challenges on the ground. And you look back to when the Harper government was looking to build Northern Gateway, and it was, there was very substantial opposition, even from people who are or are now in the Conservative caucus to the pipeline project.
Because of the sensitive areas it goes through. I mean, I can tell you from my experience in public opinion research that Canadians do not believe that humans know how to build something in the ground that will never crack or break.
And I don't think we can ever promise that, right? We know that, and yes, a pipeline spill in those areas is going to be challenging to mitigate. And everyone has those, as you'll know, you put something in people's living rooms, like how do people get exposed to the idea of oil on the northwest coast of North America as the Exxon Valdez? And that's still, those pictures are still in. Everybody sort of my age or older has those images still in their head.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, this has been incredibly revealing. I want to just switch gears for a second and talk. I read about you this morning. I saw your name on a fairly august list of people who have joined something called Lead Not Leave. Now, there's a lot of economists on here, so I'm not expecting great comms out of this organization. But maybe you could tell me what it's about.
Well, we have Jen Gerson with us, so that should help, and Peggy Garrity.
The only worse communicators than economists are journalists.
We've got some decent comms support, and Ken Bosanquist, Jared. But yes, we've got myself, Trevor Toome, Jem Dinning, Travis Taves, Peggy Garrity, Jen Gerson. So we have a great list. I probably missed someone as I was rattling them off. Jared Wesley from the University of Alberta. So I've missed some, but the idea here is to bring forward a group of engaged Albertans. I think mostly swinging to the right side of the political spectrum. And to build that conversation that separatism isn't the only alternative to the status quo. And of course, some of the people on that list have advocated for a long list of changes over time. That's really what we're trying to get is those conversations that aren't just, you have one of two options, the Canada that you've known for the last however many years you're upset about, or vote to trigger a secession process.
Is the country a cost-benefit analysis?
Not for me.
A daily, weekly cost-benefit analysis? I mean, I'm frustrated by this.
As am I. I mean, where it really hits me is we just saw it a few weeks ago, too short this year, but you watch the playoffs at downtown when the Oilers are in the playoffs, and you watch people stand and sing the national anthem, and there's no one sitting on their hands, at least that I've ever seen. And so that idea that I'm annoyed about the last prime minister, or I'm annoyed about the last environment minister, or the last 10 years have not been viable. To me, that's not how this is approached. And I think we all also seen the negative side of it. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Quebec, lived there for a couple of years. And I think we gloss over the negative consequences sometimes of, where Quebec was in the 60s and early 70s.
Montreal was the economic capital of Canada, was population larger than Toronto, powerful, much more powerful than Toronto.
I watched someone had posted on Twitter a week or so ago an old National Film Board piece about Toronto, and it was speculating about the degree to which it could take over as the economic center of the country from Montreal. It was sort of scoffed at, right? All the bank head offices, everything. Well, they're not going to move to Toronto, and then maybe it's not the only cause, but you certainly see the economic fallout was massive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So lead not leave is going to, what are you going to do?
So we're going to engage in some conversations with Albertans. I think we're calling them salon conversations. We're going to be producing
That sounds
policy
very
responses.
Laurentian
It
elitist.
does, I know. But we're going to be producing some policy research. So as ideas formulate on the secessionist side, of course, we'll have some responses as we see costed out platforms. And we're learning a lot from Brexit here, where what you saw there was not a lot of directed opposition to the soundbite, the easy sound bites that were out there. And I think what we really want to do is bring, the depth of experience from two former finance ministers, the academic rigor, and the political science rigor as well, to say, what would this actually look like? What is actually involved? And to try to provide that information with obviously a pro-Canada slant.
We're happy to see Dinning involved in that because, Jim Dinning did one of the great nation building things in modern Canadian history in the 1990s when he was the finance minister in Alberta, and he convinced his provincial government to support the CPP and to support higher premiums for the CPP as the country made the Canada Pension Plan sustainable in perpetuity. Only country that has that. And back in that day, people assumed it would be dead like everybody else's pension plan, so you couldn't count on it. Now nobody says that. Jim Dinning was at the heart of making that happen. And then he did that CPP thing for Smith, and I thought maybe we've lost this guy, which would be terrible. So I'm very glad to see Jim Dinning as part of
Very
your...
glad it still kind of blows my mind a little bit to see some of those names on my phone on the text chatter. So yeah, definitely some very influential Alberta history there, and I'm glad to have them alongside.
Right. Why wouldn't a strategic Albertan say, just the threat of this got us a pipeline? Why don't we take the next step and see what we can extract out of these people?
I mean, I don't think that's true. I think when we look at the history of, getting pipeline built to the West Coast, the person who was able to deliver it and was able to put their political capital on the line was Prime Minister Trudeau. And
Next thing can go to China.
Well, potentially, but I think, and we're going to see what happens from Prime Minister Carney, but I think Prime Minister Carney, as far as I can tell, the pipeline has nothing really it's not a response to Alberta separatism. I mean, he's an infrastructure and banking guy. He's looking at this as, I would imagine, and saying, look at the value of the resource in Northern Alberta and look at the motivation for the Canadian Federation. It's moving our products freely across borders. This is what we do. And so I don't know that it makes sense to frame it as a response to separatism. I just think it's good economic policy to at least enable and not block that kind of infrastructure. Premier Smith has without a doubt changed the conversation around environmental policy and energy policy in a way. But she was pushing back against a Liberal Prime Minister who had a different vision for that.
How bad was it? Can I just ask you that? How bad was it? Like the phrase 10 lost years or a lost decade now seems to be the conventional wisdom around the Trudeau government. Like, you just say that and you don't need to introduce evidence. It's just accepted around whatever table you're talking at. Is that true?
I don't think that's true. I think what you had with the Trudeau government was, number one, you had really bad circumstances. Oil prices globally started to collapse in 2014. You have big change in Alberta, you have big change in Ottawa, and, people correlate all of those things together and say, but for Trudeau, you would have had this continued massive expansion in the oil sands. I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any evidence to support it. Global investment went down dramatically in the upstream sectors. It's never recovered. But I do think what you had was, a government that was maybe a little bit too flippant about its dismissal of those opportunities, and a little bit too willing to layer on regulation after regulation. And you saw it also just in the perception. So the Impact Assessment Act, the dreaded C-69, right? The clauses that were ruled unconstitutional in that legislation were actually taken from Harper era policy in 2012. So they were not any different than that. The difference was you had a different decision maker at the front of the line, right? When that minister or cabinet decision was being made, people in Calgary, people I think in lots of other parts of the country, trusted that the Harper government was at least going to make a decision that favored economic development. When they looked at a Prime Minister Trudeau and a Minister Guilbeault or Minister McKenna, they did not trust the decision maker at the top of the line was aligned with them. It was never really the legislation, it was the decision maker. And I hope you're going to see that change now. But I think there was a willingness to say too quickly, and you know, despite the fact that Trudeau built the Trudeau government built two major pipeline projects, Line 3 and TMX, there's still this perception that, well, but were they really behind it? You know, they negotiated hard to get Keystone XL, but did they really want it? Well, yeah, but that just sort of crept in and took over.
That's a pretty flimsy basis to break up a country. We can both agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the one that I'll say that I find hard to stomach is when we say, well, you know, separating because we don't like the results of the last election. And, you know, that to me says that's not the way you think about a country with the history of Canada. And the fact that, you know, we've been all over people move all over our country. That idea that one federal election change would be the basis for a separation of a province from the country is almost unfathomable to me.
As if Alberta is the only province that's ever alienated from an election result, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you.
I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope you'll come back on. We'll have a longer chat sometime.
Anytime.
All right, Herle Burly-ites, that's our deep dive into the economics of the MOU and about the oil industry and its impact on climate change. I really want to thank Aaron Wherry and Rick Smith and Andrew Leach for joining us and sharing their insights and wisdom with us. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. So thanks to them. Thanks to the sponsors who make this show possible. And thanks to all of you who watch or listen. And show up next week and we'll have some more interesting Herle Burly info for you. Take care of yourselves.
Herle Burly,